Hello and welcome to another Quiet Riot special, which today has a very Scottish flavour, by the way, big man. Amid the gallons of iron brew and lashings of deep-fried haggis, we'll be feasting on the SNP conference with a side dish of other Scottish politics. I'm Kenny Campbell. Before we start, a quick reminder that you can support our work by signing up for a few quid at ko-fi.com/quietriotpod. Supporters get access to our Discord channel, plus our live editorial and Ask Us Anything video events, and we love every one of them dearly. If you've been following Scottish football, and I quite understand if you haven't, you'll know that Scotland's developed a knack for winning games despite some truly abysmal performances on the pitch. If we were to be a little harsh, some might say the same's been true of the SNP. In power for 18 years, able to land electoral wins, but bedevilled in recent times by own goals, a lacklustre defence, and an inability to score victories in the big challenges, such as health and, indeed, independence. The SNP, of course, will point to things like a free university education, free prescriptions, free bus passes, and such like, to prove that they are well capable of delivering on issues that matter, winning in cup games, even if you struggle in the league, as it were. Well, over the weekend and into this week, the SNP faithful convened in Aberdeen, Scotland's chilly grey granite capital of oil, and home too to the buttery, which is a fabulously greasy, salty, squished bread roll that cures hangovers and hardens arteries simultaneously. Now, it seems that SNP members have been feasting on butteries because, despite the hangover of recent years, there was an air of positivity about their annual conference, helped in no small part by polling showing that SNP support has started to build again modestly, as its big rivals have watched their vote share gobbled by Reform UK, who else? To discuss all this in a little more detail, I'm delighted to be joined today by the Telegraph's Scotland reporter, Jacob Freedland, who was at the conference. Jacob, welcome to the show.
Good to be here, Kenny.
Well, this was your first SNP conference, wasn't it? Did you try a buttery while you were in Aberdeen?
I have to say I did, although when we were given it, they were called rowies.
Rowies, that's rowies. Right, a rowie, yeah.
And it was only when you described it as a flaky, squished, buttery kind of type bread that I knew it was the same thing.
Was that your first ever buttery? Your first rowie?
It was.
Oh my goodness me! I mean that's foreign food. Well done. That's exotic fare. I loved rowies. There probably still is. There certainly was, just off King Street in Aberdeen. And King Street, for folk who don't know Aberdeen, is kind of the second street. Union Street is the main thoroughfare. And then off it at one end, King Street. And there was a King Street bakery when I was in Aberdeen. And after a hard night of doing what students do, you pop by the King Street bakery on the way back home. And for just a few pence, you get a couple of rowies. And the world would be such a nice place all of a sudden. Freshly baked heart attacks. They were great. Good.
Is that where you were a student?
I did my years in Aberdeen, yeah. I studied economics and politics at Aberdeen. And then my first proper job in media was at the Press and Journal, which is the Aberdeen-based newspaper of record. And a very, very fine organ it is as well. So I did 4 years as a student in Aberdeen, went away and worked in Perth for a little while, and then returned to do 2 more years learning the ropes of newspaper stuff at the P&J up on Langstracht, as it was back then. So I know it well. I know how cold and grey it gets at this time of the year as well. What do you think then? What were the big talking points from the conference? What was your takeaway?
The first thing to say is that this really was about one word: independence.
Right.
That was the slogan that you couldn't really escape. And it is very much John Swinney's attempt to make this the issue with the election next year. There's some quite interesting thinking going on behind this, which is that the SNP vote is kind of hovering around the 30% mark. And as you said, that's an improvement on what it was like a few months ago. But the independence vote, or the share of Scots who want who would vote independence if there were a referendum held, is actually around 50, but above 50. And so the thinking among people in the SNP is you can really squeeze that kind of distance between those two numbers. That is how you'll get a majority. You just have to push at that 20%.
And I mean, independent strategy above all is really my takeaway from the conference as well. I mean, the party backed Swinney's idea that if the SNP gets a majority of seats, that's a mandate for another independence vote. But Swinney has pulled back, hasn't he, from the idea that if several parties combined who have an independence-leaning set of beliefs were to get seats, that would also be the green light for a second mandate. So they've made it slightly more challenging for themselves, haven't they?
That's right. It's this was a sort of rebel motion pioneered by some, let's just say, sort of eccentric characters in the party who were a real joy actually to see come up to the podium and speak. One of them included a tweed wearing sort of retired solicitor called Graham McCormick, who I'm sure to SNP nerds will be a very familiar character. He was unknown to me until this conference, but he was the guy spearheading this rebel amendment. He came up to the stage, and he's an older guy. He came to the stage, and the first thing he says is, "What do we want?" And the crowd bellow back, "Independence." And he goes, "When do we want it now?" And it was quite an entrance. It definitely woke people up. He was responsible for this amendment, and as you say, it said the only mandate we need to push ahead with independence negotiations. So not even a referendum, actually, proper negotiating with the UK government. All we need is for pro-independence MSPs, not only at SNP candidates, all pro-independence MSPs, to get a majority, and that will be good enough.
Firebrand and old school as well. My knowledge of the SNP goes back to the days of Winnie Ewing, Madame Écosse, as she was known in European circles. And the SNP was quite a different party then. It had that fire in its belly. And, it's good to hear that there are people who have survived from that era, I suppose, who still have a bit of fire in the belly. You were at the Manchester Conservative Conference as well, weren't you, for your sins? Was there a bit of a contrast in atmosphere between the two of those events?
Well, there were no rowies, unfortunately. So I had to stick to the sort of the more English kind of Greg's pasty to absorb last night's free alcohol. How was it different? Well, it was more depressed, I think. Is what I would say. So, the SNP are. It sounds weird to say this, but they are. If you're looking at the last year, they are sort of on the up.
Yeah.
And the sense was that the ship had been steadied by John Swinney this year, and you compare that to where they were last year and the sort of the months leading up to that, where there was a lot of instability around Hamza Yousaf's very short-lived premiership. And so the ship has been steadied, and not only has it been steadied, it's also sailing in the right direction, I think is how they would see it. So polling numbers are quite good. Labour, Scottish Labour, which is the sort of primary challenger here, although that could be changing with the rise of reform. The Scottish Labour are really suffering because of the unpopularity of their UK counterpart in the form of Keir Starmer. So things are shaping up okay going into next year.
And then beyond independence, the focus was really on public services, wasn't it? Especially health. And Scotland's public health record is just appalling, really. There are very well documented problems with drug abuse, amongst other things. Swinney's big announcement was the unveiling of walk-in health clinics, wasn't it?
The SNP government will open a nationwide network of walk-in GP services based in your community on your local high street, near your child's school, or close to your workplace. They will break from the status quo. They will add to the care we already value, staffed by GPs and nurses, open from 12 noon to 8 p.m, and you won't need to call up for an appointment. That means more people can go after work when it fits with their lives. And to make that even easier, they'll be open 7 days a week.
Hey, I'm not one to knock attempts to improve public health, but does anybody have any idea where the money and the people to staff these clinics are coming from?
Well, that's the question. This was put to Swinney's spokesman yesterday. He couldn't give a timetable for when these 15 would open. All we know is that there will be one open in the next year. That's it. So it's more moderate, I think, than that.
That's going to be a very busy GP centre, isn't it? There's only one in all of Scotland.
There's going to be queues. But in terms of where this funding is going to be coming from, we also don't really have an idea of that yet.
The ballpark figure is it's going to cost something like £30 million, which doesn't actually sound that much for 15 or more walk-in centres with GPs and ancillary staff as well. But they've got a problem, the SNP, haven't they? Because back in 2017, they said they were going to recruit another 800 GPs over the following decade, but they've only managed 200. So they're already a bit behind in terms of having the sort of professional manpower that they would need to see these ambitions through, aren't they?
Yes, the medical authorities in Scotland have been a bit sceptical over this announcement. The BMA in Scotland said that the walk-in GPs in England haven't demonstrated particularly good value for money.
That phrase, yeah.
And their worry is that this will divert resources that would be better deployed elsewhere. And so there is this sort of skepticism towards that. And as you rightly said, this isn't the first time that SNP ministers have sort of had these very shiny headline policies, but they don't really get delivered in the way that they are first outlined.
There were a few topics that were kind of notable by their absence, weren't there? Did any topics leap out at you because there weren't any keynote addresses?
Well, interestingly, the two biggest departments in terms of how much they spend, so that's in Scotland, so that's health and education. Neither of those ministers or cabinet secretaries delivered a keynote address to the conference. The absence of those two people does tell you a lot. It tells you what the SNP want to hide, because the records on those two areas are not great. Yeah. I mean, in education, Scotland is slipping down the rankings in terms of results, and as we've discussed, health has a similar picture. Yep. So Dundee remains the drug death capital of Europe. Education is a similarly sort of disappointing picture. The reason for that is not only what the SNP are trying to hide that, but it's also trying to divert attention onto the future. And by the future, I mean, again, independence.
Yeah. And I suppose it's fair to say that the people doing the organisation of the conference wanted a really clean message on independence and competence, I suppose, rather than a pile-on over waiting lists or educational attainment gaps. From a conference perspective, I dare say it makes perfectly good sense.
Yes. The thing I would just add to that perhaps further explains this decision, is the health, education, the economy. These are actually what Scottish voters are most interested in at the moment.
Right.
And that's where those are the issues that people have told pollsters they're going to base their vote on next year. And so if you draw attention to that, if you focus on those things, you're just leaving yourself really liable to criticism. Outside of the conference, that is actually what people care about.
Right. The polling that I've seen suggests that obviously there's probably a quarter of Scottish people who put independence right at the top of the shopping list politically, certainly of engaged voters. But with the vast majority of the rest, even those who are pro-independence, have it at number 8 or number 9 on their list. It's not a vote grabber, is it, for the vast majority of people in Scotland?
No, it's not. But what it is it's a key thing for both the SNP voters, but particularly the members. And those were the people that a lot of this conference was really pitched at. This same polling carried out by More in Common found that of the top 5 issues that SNP voters care about, basically the top 4 are related to the union in some way.
Right.
So if you want to just squeeze that core constituency, that's what you need to be running on. And that's what John Swinney is doing.
Scotland remains, I suppose, a nation that's divided down the middle still on independence. I think it's not so much that independence sentiment has collapsed. It's certainly not collapsed at all. But for a lot of people, it's become more background noise rather than a rallying cry, hasn't it? And what the SNP really now have to do is reconnect the constitutional idea with everyday problems that we've mentioned, like the NHS queues and the cost of living bills.
These two things initially seem to be contradictory. The fact that support for independence is still over 50%. So that you have that on one hand, but equally it's gone down the list on what voters are concerned about. The way I would make sense of that is if the question was posed, people would vote for independence.
Yeah.
But the desire to see that question posed is lower than it used to be.
If you've shopped online, chances are you've bought from a business powered by Shopify. You know that purple Shop Pay button you see at checkout? The one that makes buying so incredibly easy? That's Shopify. And there's a reason so many businesses sell with it, because Shopify makes it incredibly easy to start and run your business. Shopify is the commerce platform behind 10% of all e-commerce in the US. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/promo. Go to shopify.com/promo.
That's the policy side of things. Conferences can make or break leaders. How do you think Swinney did?
Wasn't the first time he's done a conference as a leader, interestingly. No. He was playing to a home crowd this weekend. There is just no way to get around that, and to continue the football analogy. It was like as though there were sort of no away fans there. I mean, it was like a game during COVID or something when
that's kind of his modus operandi, isn't it though? He is he's the trusted, serious person. He's the bank manager up giving a speech.
Exactly.
And he's more serious than Keir Starmer, which I find quite remarkable.
Funnier, I would say. He is funnier. He did a speech to the sort of Scottish press, which I won't go into, but he cracked quite a few jokes actually, and I think we saw a more human side to him than you would get when during his very serious persona on stage. But to take Quiet Riot listeners behind the curtain on what that was like.
Oh yes, do.
He was funny actually. He was funny, and he was very
off the cuff funny or scripted funny.
No, he was off the cuff. It wasn't. He didn't have his teleprompter on. I mean, when he does the main address, obviously he's got the teleprompter.
Yeah, and
he very rarely, I mean, if at all, deviates from that in a way that Ian Murray, the now former Scottish secretary, the Labour Scottish secretary, would often deviate from. Right. And I remember seeing Ian Murray give a sort of talk opening the Edinburgh Fringe back in August, and he would ad-lib quite a bit actually. He would, I remember trying to check what the teleprompter had on it and what he was saying, and he did do these riffs.
Not Trump-esque riffs. I mean,
no, not
actually
quite
making
that level.
sense.
Not quite that level, yeah. Unfortunately, too much coherence to qualify for being Trump-esque. But no, Swinney, when he talks, he does it very, very by the book. But during this little gathering, it was a little bit. He was warmer, more relaxed. He had his wife and son there, right. And the fact is he's been in the game for a long time, and so he really has a lot of relationships with people, and that you could really see that again to contrast him with the other technocrat down in Westminster, Keir Starmer. Yeah. Starmer is much more new to it, and you can see that.
I mean, that's such good insight. It used to frustrate me when I was in newspapers, when I would meet particular politicians whose in private persona was just so uh, massively different to the public image that they presented. And I'd find myself thinking, why don't you put a little bit more of you, the person, rather than you, the politician, in? I used to find it very frustrating. Gordon Brown, I found a fascinating person to talk to when the microphones were off, warm, engaging, knowledgeable, all the things you would expect. And then the moment you were into interview mode, literally the colour of his skin would change. I remember watching that in Number 10. Do you, as a political journalist, do you find that frustrating that we don't get more of the behind the scenes people? Or is that just the price of doing a job that's so much in the public eye?
I'm not the one who would feel frustrated. I actually feel frustrated on behalf of voters.
Right.
Because we do get to see these people when the cameras are off. I would actually say that I'm more frustrated on behalf of voters than I am for myself, because we actually do part of this job. You do have that kind of intimacy with politicians. You're talking to them, you get to know them, you build those relationships. But voters don't see that. They only see the very, very packaged versions. And I think their relationship with politicians would change if they saw what we see.
Right.
But that is the nature of sort of media management, I think.
It is,
in this day and age.
absolutely. And it does mean that you get really good stories to tell down the pub that nobody else gets to tell, doesn't it? You've got that social currency, which is, you'll never believe what I heard behind the scenes in Aberdeen.
That's right. They were all on very good behaviour.
It's just so distressing when that happens. Conferences never used to be about that. There was always about one bottle of wine too many, and who's that staggering off the curb? We've heard about how John Swinney performed at the conference. Is he appealing to the same sort of voters that Sturgeon, for example, appealed to, or is there a different profile starting to come through?
Interestingly, John Swinney appeals to somebody quite different to what Nicola Sturgeon spoke to. Nicola Sturgeon was from the west of Scotland, and she was rooted in that quite sort of working class part of that country. John Swinney represents Perth, and it's a more middle class area. It's more affluent. And he speaks to that kind of person, I think, more. He speaks their language in a way that Nicola could do, but John Swinney, I think, does more effectively. That's partly to do with the fact that he's sort of read as a kind of bank manager, bureaucrat type person. Some people refer to him as sort of the SNP's company man. He's been there for ages, trusted pair of hands. So there's definitely that, but it's also just not just the time he's been in the party, been in government, but also his demeanour. He is nowhere near as fiery as Nicola Sturgeon was, and while that's disappointing perhaps for sort of newsmaking,
Tell me about it.
A certain type of voter really likes that, actually, and likes the fact that he's sort of more softly spoken, a little bit more reassuring. I think if you are one of our sort of mortgage holder types.
There was a blast in the past when Nicola Sturgeon did a really, really brief flyby, didn't she? I don't suppose you were there, were you?
I was, and
you were. Good.
I was, and I'll have an interesting observation about Nicola Sturgeon and her presence at conference, which is she did book signing, right? So
yeah.
she's there with her kind of fan club, who pack out arenas where she's speaking and are buying this book. And there was a queue. People were taking selfies and all the usual rest of it, and a lot of young people too, which I thought was quite interesting, because a lot of people under the age of 25 really won't have voted
I mean, when you're talking about young, you are talking sort of teenage and young, early 20s.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of thinking sort of students and down, basically.
Right.
A lot of those people were very enamoured by her. And it's interesting that because a lot of them wouldn't have actually been old enough to vote in a referendum. And yet sort of, I think she is seen for a lot of people, a lot of young women in particular, I think, as a sort of feminist hero. You compare her to other sort of like female leaders that the UK has had. I mean, she's just in a different league, really. And I think she's really quite inspirational for a lot of people. So they were all there in big numbers. But what was interesting is when the book signing was done, she wasn't mobbed wherever she went around the conference. And I remember walking into a sort of hotel bar where people, kick back at the end of the day. And there she was on her phone, standing by the entrance. And I there may be context there as to why she was just there, but she was just there alone, not being hassled. Some of the conversations I've had with people over the weekend was that would have been pretty unthinkable in years gone by.
Absolutely.
And in conferences as recent as sort of last year, you could not find her alone. You could not find her without a whole crew of people trying to get within touching distance.
Isn't that interesting?
But that seems to have changed. And well, I mean, people can draw their own conclusions from that, but it did seem as though the party is slightly, and the party faithful are kind of drawing a line and thinking, okay,
there's been a break with the past.
A little bit. We need to we've sort of had that, and and it's an incredible legacy, but we need to now think about the future.
It made perfect sense when I saw that she was coming in to do a book signing. I figured that I know how I'd arrange that. And that's going to be a cameo, not a comeback, isn't it? And she's been quite careful to not tread on any landmines when she's been doing it. And it's the last time that she'll attend an SNP conference, presumably as an MSP. So there's a little bit of history, I suppose, being made there as well. Did you have any big takeaways yourself from the event, over and above just how delicious, amazing, and bad for your heart rowies are?
The main thing I will remember from that is how salty they are. I did not. I just, it was. I literally had to have a sort of pint of water afterwards because it was. There was a lot of salt in it. The thing I've written about this in a piece I've done for the Telegraph, a sort of snap reaction to it. The thing that really struck me, and it struck me as somebody who is used to covering politics in England and news in England more generally, is independence is used as a kind of utopian promise by the SNP. That's what really stood out to me, and it's this sort of device which allows ministers and activists to sort of promise that this is going to be the way to a better future, and the problems that you are in your life and the lives of people in your community are caused by this arrangement that the country currently has inside Britain, and that as soon as we can change that, everything will improve. The reason you're on a long waiting list for an appointment is because the NHS is being run dysfunctionally. The reason why energy bills are so high is because Westminster's sort of rapacious energy profits levy, this, or otherwise known as the windfall tax, on North Sea oil. But as soon as we leave, all of that is going to change. And I do think it's that the idea of there's this thing which we can have, which is to say independence, but we don't at the moment, is why, despite 18 years of being in power for 18 years, the SNP continues to win elections, because it's just such a brilliant sell. And that just isn't going to change if independence continues to be a sort of demand rather than a reality.
The SNP works while independence is not granted. That's
exactly.
long been
That's a much more concise way of putting it.
So while the SNP have been fairly upbeat, if we're being honest, there's not been a lot of joy for their erstwhile rivals in Labour and Conservative circles north of the border. The organisation More in Common and their director, Luke Trill, is a friend of our show. Hello, Luke. So More in Common did some work for the SNP ahead of the conference. They did some fairly heavyweight polling about a month ago now, beginning of last month, so it's fairly up to date. And their kind of takeaway was that since the last general election, Labour's support in Scotland has more than halved, while the SNP has marginally improved its standing. Now, while not seeing a significant rise as in England, Reform has emerged as a potential second place party after the SNP in Scotland, suppressing the Conservatives' vote share as well as seriously eating into Labour's. They've crunched the numbers and they reckon SNP would maybe lose 11 points in the constituency vote at next year's elections. That would put the SNP just shy of a majority in Holyrood, mostly due to the fragmentation of other parties. Sounds a little bit familiar, doesn't it? Jacob, what do you think? Do you think Labour are a bit of a busted flush in Scotland now?
Too soon to say that, perhaps. A lot can change. There was a very good piece in today's Daily Record by the paper's political editor, Paul Hutchin, who said that the thing that is sort of inflating the SNP's numbers at the moment is the skyrocketing success of Reform. Because faced with that option, a lot of people will back the SNP. Reform is also eating into Labour's vote, but that really could change. And any conversation about the success of Reform is always worth caveating by saying Farage does have a record of falling out with people,
Yes.
and things turning out different to how to the way they might otherwise seem. That is equally possible. So that is, if Reform do flounder, however, even though that does look quite unlikely, it could put Scottish Labour back into the picture. But at the moment, absolutely, you're right to say things are not looking great for them.
The work that More in Common did had some really interesting stuff in Reform. And trigger warning, I know a lot of our listeners get nervous, shall we say, when we mention Reform and Farage, but it would be naive to ignore them. And More in Common had some really good little nuggets of insight, I think. They were looking at the rise of Reform and any threat that Reform might pose to the SNP. And, they said that's going to, as you said yourself, Jacob, probably stem from its ability to pick up voters from other parties to form its base, rather than taking support away from the SNP itself. Now, most of the voters who have moved over to Reform in Scotland since the general election have come from Labour or from the Conservatives. But More in Common had a little nugget, and they took a historic perspective on where some of Reform's supporters are coming from. And they discovered that 20% of current Reform voters voted for the SNP in 2019, and 45% of current Reform voters have voted SNP at some point in the past. So there's a lot of people in Scotland, as in the rest of the country, presumably, been on a long political journey from left-leaning, very pro-independence, to right-leaning and very nationalist. There was a couple of other little nuggets in there as well. The MRP work that More in Common did said that if a general election was held today, SNP would win 34 seats. So that's just over half. Reform would get 13, and Labour would hold on to just 4 seats in Scotland. That, less than a third of the number of seats that Reform would get, which is, it's a thing, definitely. One of the key takeaways, though, was how close the race is in quite a lot of constituencies. More than 1 in 10 of the constituencies, there was only 3% between the leading parties. And there was one other question that I really liked that the pollsters asked, and that was quite simply, is Reform too English to do well in Scotland? And, if you've lived in Scotland, you'll know exactly what that's driving at. And their findings were that half of Scots think that Reform is mainly a party for England. Even 16% of Reform backers in Scotland think that Reform is too English for Scotland. So they're quite, self-aware in that respect. Is there anything, Jacob, do you think, though, that the Tories north of the border in particular can do about the rise of Reform on the right?
I interviewed, actually, the leader of the Scottish Tories, Russell Findlay, in Manchester.
Former journalist, yeah.
A former journalist, exactly. Their pitch going into the Holyrood election next year is all these things that you like, that you're attracted to Reform about. So tackling illegal immigration, solving crime, taxes, this sort of stuff. They're saying we're the ones who can actually deliver that. Right. So if you actually are serious about these things and you actually want, competent adults to do it, then vote for us. So that's one side of the offer to those people who are kind of Reform curious. The other part seems very obvious, but it's worth spelling out, is the union. And
yes,
and Russell Findlay told me that Nigel Farage is a threat to the union. He actually used that word. That is something which I think is they're gonna, as we get closer, gonna make more noise about.
It's a fascinating conundrum for politicians in Scotland, really, that Farage's way of operating is to create division, of course, and he's splitting the right very effectively at the moment. But of course, that makes him, in some ways, the best friend that the SNP have got electorally, who isn't within their camp. In terms of the broader political engagement that Scottish voters have got, for the last year, 18 months, media in Scotland have talked about the scunner factor. Scunner meaning fed up, cheesed off, pissed off, basically. They're fed up with politics and they just want to either burn it all to the ground or vote for something that sounds a little bit different. Is there any sign at all that that scunner factor is easing in Scotland?
Easing in the sense that it's becoming less of a factor, do you think? Is that sort of what you're sort of getting at?
Yeah, is there less of the, not necessarily more engagement, but less disengagement with the world of politics that I heard when I was on doorsteps? People going, I'm just fed up a lot of them. I wish they'd all go away.
Yeah. No, that attitude seems to be alive and well, unfortunately. There was a by-election in Hamilton in June. It was a seat in the Scottish Parliament. Labour ended up getting that seat. They took it back from the SNP.
Yep.
Reform made huge inroads there. And to give you a sense of what Hamilton is like as a seat, it's in the central belt of Scotland. It's one of these sort of de-industrial, poorer places, and it has exactly that kind of voter. I'm sure Luke Woodall have sort of studied and discussed, which is just the system isn't working for me. Things are getting worse, and I will vote for whatever. I'll just do a roll of the dice because I have very little to lose. Reform picked up; it massively expanded their share of the vote. They didn't, to be clear, they didn't win, but they massively widened their share, and so that dynamic is absolutely still happening. I think just an interesting nuance that slightly complicates that picture, which I think can be very tempting to draw for sort of political journalists and commentators. Reform are really surging in the northeast of Scotland.
Right, now, Buck in north of Aberdeen, basically, for people that don't know the geography.
That's right. And the oil industry, which was a huge employer in these places, has kind of receded in how many people are involved in the industry and the associated salaries. But there is still a lot of money in Aberdeen and in those parts of the northeast to do with that industry, and yet Reform are doing really well there. And those used to be Tory heartlands in Scotland, and it's actually Reform that are surging in those places. And so absolutely, a lot of those people will be saying, "Oh well, politicians are in it for themselves," and they'll be making those kind of noises that like those that you described just earlier. But also, there's a lot of people there who actually think, the Tories used to work in my interests, but they were the ones in Westminster who introduced the windfall tax in the first place, or massively raised it. And Reform are saying, drill, baby, drill in the North Sea. So my interests are pushing me quite rationally in that direction. So for a lot of people, it's not just a sort of anti-system thing, but actually to do with very sort of rational economic interests.
I've one final question. What does what's going on in Scotland really mean for the rest of the UK, do you think?
The main question, if you're thinking about this from the perspective of Westminster, is basically, I don't know, are we allowed to swear on this podcast, Gary?
You can indeed.
Is how fucked are Labour? That is essentially the question. Because if Labour really get a drumming in May in Scotland, and they get booted out entirely in Wales, which is also looking possible, and they lose council seats in cities, then the pressure will really be on Starmer to sort it out or to go. And Scotland, I think, is going to form part of that story. Yeah,
I think you couldn't be more right. And you highlighted the Welsh challenge that Labour faced. But the bottom line is that come the general election, we're a few years out, but come the general election, if Labour crater in Scotland and Wales and Reform start to pick up a handful of seats in both, and, as might well happen, it's a particularly close run election, all of a sudden picking up a handful of seats here and there while Labour are really going in the bin becomes hugely significant, particularly in a first past the post system where once you get more than 30% of the vote, you start to really pick up seats all over the country.
That's
Attention must be paid.
Yes. I mean, the other thing, potentially, the story running parallel to that, I mean, it just needs to be said, is about Reform and how far can they go. If they do, as some polls are suggesting, become the second biggest party in Scotland, and currently, it's worth saying, they don't have a Scottish leader.
No.
And in spite of that, they're polling really, really well. So if they have a good election, that again bodes interestingly for 2029. The relevance of this election to a kind of the UK political picture is basically as a sort of litmus test or a predictor for the general election at the end of the decade.
Riot. Jacob, thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Kenny.
I would love to have you back, particularly to talk all things Scottish, Celtic and everywhere else as well. That's it for this Quiet Riot special. Hit me up on Blue Sky if you've got any comments. Just search for Mr. Kenny Campbell. We'll all be back tomorrow for our main show, and there is a lot of news to pile through, plus lots of your favourite features. Don't forget to tell your friends about us. Help us on ko-fi.com/quietriotpod, and most importantly, do please keep listening. We love you all. Bye.